Olá, sejam muito bem-vindas e bem-vindos. Eu sou o Eduardo Kruel e vou dar início ao nosso evento especial, Desafios da Leitura, O Cérebro Leitor. É uma enorme satisfação ter vocês aqui para participar dessa conversa com uma convidada muito especial. Vamos tratar do desenvolvimento da competência leitora no nosso cérebro e os impactos que mudanças sociais, como a digitalização dos nossos meios de comunicação, podem ter nesse desenvolvimento. Seja como pais ou mães, como educadores, como editores e produtores de conteúdo, seja como formuladores de políticas públicas, a discussão, tenho certeza, vai instigar reflexões importantíssimas sobre o que fazemos e sobre o que deveríamos fazer. Gostaria, antes de mais nada, agradecer a Abrelivros pelo convite para organizar e mediar essa live, agradecer a Maryanne por sua atenção e disponibilidade para estar conosco hoje, e agradecer a Editora Contexto, especialmente ao Daniel Pinsky, por todo o apoio para trazermos a Maryanne. Aproveitando o ensejo, a Editora Contexto disponibilizou um cupom de desconto para a compra dos livros da Maryanne. Mais detalhes no descritivo desse evento no YouTube. Bem, muito bem. Gostaria de iniciar passando a palavra para Ângelo Xavier, presidente da Associação Brasileira de Livros e Conteúdos Educacionais, a Abrelivros. Ângelo, por favor.
Valeu, Edu. Boa tarde a todos e a todas. É uma grande alegria e um prazer estar aqui participando dessa live tão especial, promovida pela Abrelivros, e uma honra contar com a presença da renomada professora e pesquisadora Maryanne Wolf. A leitura é um tema central para todos nós, especialmente em tempos de mudanças tão aceleradas. E o trabalho de Maryanne tem mostrado como esse hábito impacta não apenas o desenvolvimento humano, mas também a forma como moldamos nosso pensamento crítico. O tema dessa live, Desafios da Leitura, O Cérebro Leitor, não poderia ser mais oportuno. Estamos vivendo uma era de transição tecnológica que tem alterado significativamente a maneira como consumimos informação, o que nos desafia a refletir sobre o equilíbrio entre as plataformas digitais e os formatos tradicionais, como o livro impresso. A Abrelivros já vem discutindo há tempos o papel dos formatos digital e impresso e seus impactos na leitura e na maneira como absorvemos conhecimento. Trata-se hoje de um tema atual e de extrema relevância que exige atenção e reflexão especial diante das transformações rápidas que afetam a forma como alunos e professores se relacionam com o conhecimento. Em 2023, realizamos a live E Agora, o Avanço Digital e o Futuro do Livro Didático, no qual apresentamos a tradução do estudo Papel e Digital, pesquisa sobre a eficácia dos materiais didáticos, realizados em parceria com a Associação Internacional de Editores, o IPA, e a Associação Norueguesa de Editores. Esse estudo analisou como o material digital pode complementar o impresso, mostrando que, enquanto os recursos digitais oferecem inúmeras possibilidades, o livro físico continua indispensável para que a retenção do conhecimento. Sabemos que os recursos digitais, embora valiosos, dispersam muito mais a atenção, algo que o material impresso não apenas evita, mas também corrige, promovendo um aprendizado mais profundo. Em 2023, durante a Bienal do Livro do Rio de Janeiro, organizamos o painel O Avanço do Digital e o Futuro do Papel na Educação, em parceria com especialistas e educadores internacionais. Discutimos a inclusão da tecnologia na sala de aula e o papel do livro na construção da sociedade. Mais recentemente, em setembro deste ano, durante a Bienal Internacional do Livro de São Paulo, lançamos a edição de 2024 do anuário Abrelivros, com o tema O Desafio da Leitura. Essa publicação, disponível no site da Abrelivros e também em braille, o anuário trata de uma série de indicadores e temas relacionados à centralidade da competência leitora na construção da sociedade. Assim, é um prazer dar continuidade a esse debate com a contribuição de Maryanne Wolf. Sua pesquisa nos tem mostrado o impacto da leitura no desenvolvimento cognitivo. Seus livros, O Cérebro no Mundo Digital e O Cérebro Leitor, são uma fonte de inspiração e alerta sobre os riscos da superficialidade que o consumo rápido de informações pode trazer. Como educadores, gestores e defensores da leitura, temos a responsabilidade de assegurar que nossas crianças e jovens desenvolvam não apenas a capacidade de ler, mas também o hábito de refletir criticamente sobre o que leem, né? Essa semana, a Abrelivros, junto com o SNEL, CBL e o Instituto ProLivro, acaba de publicar a 6ª edição da pesquisa Retratos da Leitura no Brasil. E aí a gente fica assustado com a quantidade de pessoas que se dizem não leitores. Então, é uma preocupação que nos acompanha no dia a dia. Bom, quero agradecer à equipe da Abrelivros, que tornou essa live possível, ao Eduardo Kruel, nosso mediador, que enriquecerá ainda mais o debate, e à Editora Contexto, que nos apoiou para tornar esse evento possível. E, claro, meu agradecimento especial à Maryanne por compartilhar conosco sua vasta experiência e conhecimento. Espero que esse encontro seja inspirador para todos e que possamos sair daqui com novas ideias e motivação para continuar promovendo a leitura como um pilar essencial da educação e da formação cidadã. Então, muito obrigado a todos. Edu, a palavra é tua, boa sorte e bom evento a todos.
Muito obrigado, Ângelo. Agora, sem mais delongas, é com enorme prazer que apresento a Maryanne Wolf, que é uma pesquisadora, professora e defensora das crianças e da alfabetização ao redor do mundo. É diretora do Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners and Social Justice na Universidade da Califórnia, em Los Angeles. Autora de mais de 170 publicações científicas, recebeu diversas premiações por seus estudos sobre dislexia e sobre os efeitos das diferentes mídias no desenvolvimento intelectual das pessoas. No Brasil, teve 2 de seus livros traduzidos e publicados pela Editora Contexto: O Cérebro no Mundo Digital e O Cérebro Leitor, este recentemente lançado. São livros que recomendo fortemente a leitura. E antes de passar a palavra para Maryanne, gostaria de dizer que ela fará sua apresentação em inglês, mas vocês ouvirão a tradução simultânea para o português no YouTube. Após a apresentação da Maryanne, teremos um tempinho para algumas perguntas, então se quiserem participar, escreva sua pergunta no nosso chat. Tudo bem? Maryanne, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eduardo. And what a wonderful introduction from Angelo. And thank you also to Daniel Pinsky, who persevered in bringing me to all of you. And thank you, Cecilia, who is my interpreter. It's wonderful to be with all of you who are true advocates for reading. I actually am going to share with you a presentation that is digital. So we always have the irony of how much that the digital world actually gives us, but at the same time, just as Eduardo said, it is the balance that I hope to help talk to you about, which includes the advantages and the disadvantages of the digital culture. So my talk is actually coming to you from UCLA, where I am part of a group, and this group has one very strong mission, and that is to help us all understand that literacy, deep literacy, is a basic human right that changes the brain. I need you to understand with me that reading is not something that is in the brain, like the genetic program for vision or language. No, reading is an invention that, when learned, changes the circuitry of the human brain, which helps us from that point on think differently and reflect differently, and in fact have a different trajectory of our lives, intellectually, linguistically, socially, emotionally. And just as Mr. Xavier said, there is a spiritual, ethical, political element in what it does for us. And so my joy is to bring you something of the science of reading, but I need all of you to understand that this science comes from multiple disciplines, from neurology and neuroscience to education, linguistics, etc. My job in what is called cognitive neuroscience is to help people understand, lift the hood of the brain up and look at what it takes to develop reading and how we use that knowledge for teaching, for understanding the changes that occur with different mediums. So even though I'm only going to be able to speak a little bit about the reading brain, I want you to know that that is the source of knowledge for me to make some of the conclusions and do some of the research that has implications for teaching and for intervention. But very importantly, just as both Eduardo and Danielle and Mr. Xavier said, there are implications for democracy, for how we are human beings in a connected world. Now, it begins this circuit with a very almost odd description by saying the human brain was never born to read. That's the first sentence of the Proust and the Squid book, which is I think translated for you as the reading brain. The brain has all of these parts that are genetically programmed that you see in this slide. But when we learn something new, and reading is something new, it's only 6,000 years old, it's an invention. And that brain has nothing that's only for reading. Rather, it has a design principle that allows it to connect the parts that are there in all kinds of new ways. It allows us to add and add and add the cognitive, sophisticated processes over time, but over time to that original circuit that our children are learning. Now, I want to emphasize that that circuit is plastic. Now, the circuit will reflect the language, whether it's an alphabet or like Chinese and Japanese kanji, a logo syllabary, just to give you the tiniest understanding by looking at the Chinese brain, though many things are the same, they need much more in both hemispheres in the visual areas. Now, you say, why? Because they need to have the learner represent 5,000 characters by around 5th grade. We do not have those kinds of requirements. So the requirements of the language are represented in the circuit of the brain. Now, I say that because I want you to make an analogy. Just as the plastic circuit is different for languages, it's different for teaching methods. What you emphasize is going to be reflected in that circuit, whether you are working on phonics or whether you are working on only on books. This is going to be reflective on the circuit. Most importantly for this talk, it's going to reflect the medium. What you are reading on will influence that circuit and how you read. That's a fundamental principle of my talk for you today. Now, the young brain comes to us with all these parts that aren't connected, but they are affected by the environment. And so one of the things I remember from my several trips to Brazil, the very real differences in the socioeconomic realities of our children. I visited the favelas in both São Paulo and in Rio de Janeiro. I saw how the differences in the environment are going to be reflected in that circuit. So we have to know that our teachers, who have such a burden anyway, have an additional burden to not make the differences in equity, in the poverty of not just economic poverty, but the poverty of the development of cognition and language that can go missing when a family has 2 jobs and can't emphasize how language is important in the early development. So we have to know that that environment is going to make a big difference. Now, I use a term, possum, which in Latin means to enable, to give teachers and all of us an understanding of what 5 major parts of that brain has to do. It has to have the connections. I should go back so you see it a little longer. It has to make connections between the sounds that the language has, and think of the different sounds between English and Portuguese, or Japanese and Chinese. Each language has sounds that have to be connected to the particular symbols. Now, Portuguese has an alphabet, but you have different characters when you are using Chinese. That brain has to learn to make connections between sounds and the symbols, but it has to add the meaning of the words and how the words are used. In English and in Portuguese, morphemes, these tiny units of meaning, are also very important for our teachers to understand that what the brain is doing is connecting those 5 areas, but they're connecting them to each other in time. Now, here's where Mr. Xavier made a very important point about the speed. What we are teaching our children is connecting those parts rapidly so that they can allocate time to the next. If you see those first 5, that's a decoding brain, but it has to be connected to the meaning of text, the meaning of stories and books. So you have to be fluent enough in those early decoding circuits to add what are called the deep reading processes. So our first understanding of reading is connection of those parts, meaning, sound, the morphemes, the grammar, so that that is fast enough. The word is fluency in English, fast enough to give time to deep reading comprehension. There's nothing more important in my talk than you understanding that the brain is developing deep reading processes when it's really working at its optimal. Now, we will go over 3 of those deep reading processes. There are many, but I will go over 3 so that we understand the powerful role that these deep reading processes have. I always use my dear friend and colleague, Alberto Manguel, whose book, A History of Reading, is one of the really beautiful books. I hope your audience knows this book. It's being reprinted, I think, though, in Italian right now. But what he said is that reading is cumulative. It adds everything we have read, supports and helps us understand what comes next. Our brain is putting together its background knowledge. Very, very, very important in our world today is that reading allows us to pass over. I use a theological term, passing over into the thoughts and feelings of others, understanding the perspective of others. The great Nobel Prize winning novelist Junot Diaz said, "The novel is the closest to telepathy we can come to." We literally are entering the consciousness, the thoughts, the feelings of others, and in so doing, we are the richer. We are understanding things beyond our own perspective. Human beings have an egocentrism, especially our young. The world stops in a way, and they don't necessarily understand the young, the perspective of others. Reading stories, novels, this gives our young the opportunity, a bridge to understanding who others are. It also gives us something that often is not spoken of. Humans love beauty. Reading is work. And as Toni Morrison said, another great novelist and Nobel winner, word work is sublime because it's generative. It keeps growing. We do language. We do written language, and that may be a measure of our lives. But both Danielle and Eduardo, in my correspondence with them, and now Mr. Xavier, are emphasizing the critical role of reflection and critical analysis. I may I may lose my voice. I don't think I have COVID, but I might. But I couldn't not talk to you no matter what. This slide is so important for me to give you. It is saying that our brain is making an evaluation of truth. Truth is elusive. Your journalist, those people who are writing about what is happening in society are helping us understand that truth is under threat. And our reading brain, when we teach it well, is helping us. This is almost a frontal lobe dance to evaluate our hypotheses about, is this true? What can we infer? In a world in which misinformation is rampant and worse, and here we have one election after another using disinformation, intentional falsehoods. We have to have our young trained to make judgments and to think carefully, reflectively about what is the truth of what they read and see. If we put it all together, this is Thomas Aquinas, in my version of Thomas Aquinas, we have this extraordinary reading brain in which we are using all of these processes, but that requires time. This is an essential thing to understand. For us to develop that whole reading brain circuit, we are connecting the foundational skills that have to be very rapid to the deep reading skills, which require more time. And in an era in which time is misunderstood, and the philosopher Han Byung-chul talks to us about, we live in this accelerated period in which one thing follows another so rapidly that we don't linger. The same can be true about the reading brain. We don't give enough time to those empathy, inference, and critical analytic processes, or the insights that human beings are capable of. So when we talk about deep reading, we also are going to face a very tough challenge right now. One country after another is considering digitizing the textbooks. Now, I'm not going to say this is a binary, print versus digital. I am going to say that we would err, just as my colleague Sherry Turkle from MIT said, we would transgress, we would err, we would make a great mistake, just as Sweden has done, when we just try to innovate the new, but we don't ask what it disrupts or diminishes, especially in the development of our children. Sweden digitized all its books. Korea is on the verge of digitizing. Norway, just as Mr. Xavier said, I testified for them and said, we know that Sweden is now returning to books, print, because the grades were declining. So we have to ask, what are we doing carefully? And are we just throwing the baby out with the water? Because each medium has advantages. My colleague Patricia Greenfield said, the reading circuit reflects the medium according to the affordances or characteristics of that medium, but that the digital medium, the cost, the weaknesses are that it doesn't give enough time to deep processing. And here we look at our children and our adolescents. How much time are they spending on digital devices? Our teenagers are spending the equivalent. This is almost 45% of the time of their day is spent on social media, on screens, etc. That is 3.3 months of school time. That's the equivalent. We have challenges for every age group. There's a new study this year from the Journal of American Medical, and they found that the more exposure between infancy and only first year, the less the language developed. This is important. If we look at the Singapore study, in which Singapore, Canada, McGill, Harvard, and the United States all studied what happens in digital exposure between 0 and 8 years. The more digital exposure, the less the attentional networks were developing in a good way, and the decline of their grades in academic life. So think of that, 0 to 1, 0 to 8, and then if we look at what is really underlying, you see total differences in the attention of our children. They're requiring more and more stimulation and less ability to focus their attention in really good ways. And so we have changes literally in attention and ultimately in what the brain attends to and gives time to in inference and deep reading. The studies are massive now. 2 studies from my European colleagues are showing in what are called meta-analysis, in which huge numbers of studies are put together. The major, if you will, method of studying this was to have the young adults read the same thing in print and on a screen, and then answer questions. The basic finding is that the students, the young adults, were better on print than the screen for understanding plot, sequence, details. But they think they're better on the screen. They perceive themselves better, and when you ask why, they say, because we're faster. And isn't faster better? No. This is something that the world has to understand. The brain needs time to think, and our youth are believing that the faster they are, the better they are. The reality is that not just our young adults, all of us, you, me, all of us have become skimmers because we have so much information, so many tasks ahead for us to do, that we resort as a defense mechanism to skimming. And when we skim, we go to the top, usually we scroll down or we word spot, and then we go to the bottom. Our youth are doing this, and we are doing this, and it means we are giving less consolidated time to immersion into the beauty of what reading can give us. And when I say beauty, when we truly read, we understand not only others' perspective, we understand an entire world of meaning below words, below the message of books. We are looking at a view of humanity through reading that can go missing if we're just skimming, scrolling, word spotting. Educators need to ask and teach their children that it is important to understand some things are better on print, some things are better on the screen, and you have to ask, what is the purpose? Because the purpose will be served better by different mediums. If I'm reading something superficial, I read it on a screen. If someone sends me a scientific article or a novel of beauty that I really want to read, I print out the article and I read a physical book. I want us to teach our children digital wisdom, that there are things that are better, that complement us in digital wisdom. But I also want us to ask the question, have we really taught our children, our youth, have we maintained in ourselves the joy of being immersed in that place of interiority? Now, this is a look at what I have proposed as a developmental look at how to be digitally wise and print wise. And it begins with teaching our children to read and read deeply on print, complementing it with the digital, and having digital learning happen simultaneously, coding, programming. Those are wonderful skills that are necessary. But then only after deep reading is firmly established, have our teachers able to teach how to be digitally wise and use deep reading on any medium. And the mediums will change. Now, we have a program that we use for our struggling readers that has emphases that I want to tell you for all children. The RAVO program is what it's called. You won't have it necessarily. It is translated in Italian, but not Portuguese. But when we teach, we want to teach our children how to get fast in those foundational skills, connection, that first decoding brain, and how to give more time to the deep reading skills. We use all kinds of characters to teach all of this. This is a character that I just invented in an insomniac attack so that our kids, our youth would begin to understand that when you read something, you think ahead, you predict, or afterwards you think back, what's the problem? What's the characters? What's the plot? What's the setting? But always that head in the middle, think for yourself. We need to teach our children to value their own thoughts and insights and to be critically analytic. Now, this is my whole group that you won't know, and you won't probably know about my intervention, but I also wanted to give some of you a chance to have modules that could be translated into Portuguese on how do we teach our struggling readers. So this is just a kind of gift, if you will. But most of all, I just want to leave you with this thought here, back here. We need our youth and ourselves to ask the question, what is true? What is beautiful? What do we think? And never lose those amazing capacities that the invention of written language has given us. It is upon us to teach that to our young so that our democracy will not be mocked by the superficial analysis of whatever any demagogue is saying, falsely or truly. We have democracy itself on the line if we do not have empathic, critical, analytic, and reflective citizens. So I leave you with this developmental proposal, but I leave you also with the thought, this is also a matter of joy. Don't lose the joy of being immersed in the beauty of written language. Thank you so much, and good luck in keeping all of this preserved as you expand in Brazil. Thank you again. Obrigado. I should say obrigado.
Thank you very much, Maryanne, for your wonderful speech. Just to remember who's watching us, you can write your question on YouTube and that we may read it here. Well, Maryanne, once again, thank you very much for the inspiring words. And as we were speaking before we started, just a quick note for everyone. What is amazing on your book, besides the technical details of how our brains work, it's a pleasure to read it. It's so much references, literature references, and makes us enjoy learning and enjoying it as each page as we read it. And to begin with, on your book, Proust and the Squid, you brought a data. I know this book was published quite some time ago. I believe perhaps it haven't changed so much, that on the fourth grade, around 30 to 40% students don't know how to read properly. This is a
Yes.
data quite similar in Brazil, actually. We are a little
Yes, it
bit
is.
worse on this data. And this year, Abrelivros has just published their annual report, and we brought some of these figures, these numbers.
Mhm.
And you made a point on this on your book that, as a publisher, quite connected to me. Are we doing right if around roughly 50% of our students are not acquiring this basic skill?
Yes.
Our books, our textbooks are regulated by national curriculums that, let's say, pretend that it's a fairy tale that all children will be will learn how to read and so on. And after the 4th grade, they will read to learn and not learn to read.
Yeah.
And this is quite a fantasy,
It is
perhaps in America as also in Brazil. How do you see, as a scholar, this issue? Should we be more flexible with our national standards and make we address this problem? And what we do with this gap of
Yes.
learning gap between different children that had previous contact with books, literature, and children that did not have?
So this is a very important question and area. To this moment, the figures that I used in the earlier books are even worse. So now we have, and we break it down by children in different areas of socioeconomic and different, all kinds of different categories. And what you see is only 1/3 of our children, only 1/3 are reaching this kind of deep reading, fluent comprehension level. Now, only 1/2 of that 1/3, that is 15% of our children of color are reaching that. So it's much worse than what I wrote, much worse. And in our children of color, 50% in grade 4 are not even reaching basic, not fluent comprehension, deep reading, basic. That's that decoding brain. So what we are doing is trying to figure out where did we go wrong and what can we do to correct it. And I would like to suggest to you that even in this presentation, I tried to give your audience a sense that the first parts of the reading brain circuit, that decoding, that first basic circuit, has to be developing all those parts in time. They have to become automatic. Now, there are different teaching methods in Brazil and in the United States that emphasize either the foundational skills or authentic, what they call authentic literature, whole language, balanced literacy. This is a terrible, unnecessary, and destructive separation. The brain is agnostic. The brain needs to have this connected. The people who have been trained to believe that if you just expose your children to books and great literature, they will induce the principles here, have been proven incorrect. This is really super important. It's not that this isn't important, but it should be developing after this. So what you really are doing, and I use my elbows to help people understand, these are for the foundational skills. Understanding how letter sound correspondence works, knowing how the meaning works in words. You can't just decode a word and not help the child know what it means. And sometimes people in phonics don't do that. They don't connect it to meaning and grammar and the morphemes of the language. So even the people who are doing the correct thing by inviting an understanding of phonics are not doing enough. But that foundational skills is absolutely necessary, all of them. At the same time, it has to be connected to story, to vocabulary, to books. But as this becomes automatic, this happens. And the teachers who are doing balanced literacy have a lot of skills here, but they need skills here. And the people who are doing phonics need skills here, but they never are not used. So syntax or grammar gets more complicated. The language gets more complicated. The meanings, you still have to work on this, but you have even more emphasis on deep reading. So I look at if you will, my response is you have to have both developed carefully over time, but nobody should neglect those foundational skills and assume that 50% of our kids are going to get it. 50% will, and that's a lot of the children who have all this background and they have all these advantages, but 50% of our kids are not getting it. And so our teaching has to change.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Maryanne. Let me read a question from the audience. Here's a question from Luisa Lunardi. Just let me, I have to translate simultaneously now.
Sure.
I would like to know how you see the consumption of short videos for children and adults. How much is an obstacle for the development of the brain, and how much the reading brain can follow behind because of it?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, because whether it's TikTok or all these various forms of short attentional burst, what you're doing is giving almost like a neurotransmitter high, quick, quick, quick. That's not what reading is like. And so the question is very astute. It is changing the way we have attention in our children. So we have to work hard against the tide of ever shorter burst, ever quicker hyperstimulation. Some countries are doing a very good job of thinking, what does it mean for our very young to develop attention in that way between 0 and 5? Countries like France are saying no screens before 3. Countries like China are saying only 2 hours a day, no more. Countries like the United States have had waging wars. The pediatricians wanted to say nothing before 2, but there was too much pushback, and so they're saying as a recommendation, nothing before 1.5 years. But the reality is, over time, and the questionnaire is Lucia, what she is asking is really important. Over time, our students are increasing the percentage of time on social media like TikTok and those brief bursts. In so doing, by the time they're a teenager, it's up to 45%. You know, in the middle grades, it's more like somewhere between 20 and 35. But whatever we're doing, it is changing the attentional network of our children. I am never going to say don't. The minute you absolutely decry something, it's going to actually not work. We can never use it as a punishment to take everything off, or as a reward and say, oh, if you do your homework, you get, you know, an extra hour of social media. Heavenly days, no punishment, no reward. Forget that, but have guardrails and watch with your children. You know, there is nothing more informative than to look at what the kids are seeing and watch them so you learn your own child. So, but it is absolutely changing attention to have one little burst after another, especially in our young. They have no inhibitory system that's developed. As we grow older, we get more inhibitory. But just think of it, if they don't have much of inhibitory, they're going from thing to thing to thing. And then they expect the world to go from thing to thing to thing. And reading, especially deep reading, presents even more of a challenge.
Maryanne, a follow-up question regarding this matter. As far as what we know about our brain's plasticity to make new connections, if I understood it correctly during your presentation, you mentioned that when we work with both digital and non-digital, we should actually guarantee that we have the foundation of the reading skills without the digital influence. Let's say we have this background done correctly, we grow up. Is this something we need to work on a daily basis, or we may lose our disconnections on our brain? How does it work?
The quote by Alberto Manguel is very apt here. Reading is cumulative. It influences everything that was read before. The same thing in the development of deep reading processes. The more you develop them, the more they're able to be used in the next thing you read, the next. It does not mean you shouldn't complement what you are reading with digital videos that are informative, or in my area of work, dyslexia, we have digital games that are very carefully evidence-based, that are not, they're games, but they're not addictive. This is another aspect to the digital world. It addicts the attentional system by constantly stimulating. The people who create those are using design principles from gambling. The same principles that hook you in gambling in a casino are being used in the creation of games for children. Same, how do we have intermittent reinforcement? So just know we've got a powerful industry that, let's face it, profit is an ugly aspect of what is going on. And I am agnostic about how important both mediums are over in our society. They both are important, but we need wisdom to ask, how are we going to be sure we're developing these empathic, critical, analytic skills in our young that take time in a world that's fractionated in time by the social media and games that are addicting our kids to the digital world, basically.
Thank you, Maryanne. A question from Eduardo Chile. Here in Brazil, this year we are seeing a huge discussion regarding the regulation of use of cell phones on schools. We have a lot of projects on our legislative houses. He asks you, what's your opinion, and if you could share, is there any experience on the United States or abroad that you know of this kind of regulation? How do you see it?
Yeah. So I just came back from giving a talk in Maryland and in California is the same, where they want to say no cell phones in school time. So basically they're saying no cell phone until after school. But to me, that's an inadequate response. You feel like, oh, you've done your duty. You're not letting them use the cell phone during the school. Well, that's an easy one. That's an easy out. And you think, oh, I'm doing right by children and not letting them have. We have to be thinking, not just no cell phone. I mean, that's almost a no-brainer. Why should children have cell phones during the day? When I teach undergrads and they have their phones by them, I do one thing. If it goes off during my class, I go and answer it myself and say, oh, you're the mother of my student. It's so nice to meet you. But this is a class and we don't have cell phones. I have no problems with cell phones after I answer the first cell phone during class. So you can make a joke, you can make humor. It's like we shouldn't be doing it in terms of punishment, but helping our children understand when is a good use and when is a bad use. And that's for all of our technological devices. what is good, what is bad, and teach our children to think about what is good for them, you know, and we don't preach, we help model. And here's where we get to the other question. Those children are modeling their parents who are on the cell phone all the time. It's not just our children. We have to model behavior, and that's tough. It's tough. But they're on a phone switching on and off on different things about 27 times an hour. That goes back to your other question about the attention changes.
Thank you, Maryanne. An interesting question from Dayeli. What's your opinion on the use of digital mediums for teaching adult people to learn to read?
Good question. Just as I said, you can be digitally wise and you can be print wise. There are ways that adults don't have access to teachers or to schools in the same way. So what we try to do is work with people, especially in tutoring groups, who are using very evidence-based practices. And this is really important. The digital games and the digital platforms that are teaching people to read aren't necessarily evidence-based. So my first question is what is to be used based on research that shows it works? So that's my first question. I always want to know what is best for a given individual. In dyslexia, for example, a lot of our adults have never been taught to read because they're dyslexic or they're struggling for other reasons. I want to know what is the nature of the reason they have reached adulthood without learning to read. Is it environmental? Is it environmental plus biological? And in the case of dyslexia, it's often both. But what then happens is that you need to have methods that are appropriate to that person. And in dyslexia, they need many, many, many exposures to learn some of these basic principles. A teacher can't do that as well as a digital tutor can. So there are aspects that the digital can be really helpful in practice. So that's one piece. But the best is when you can have a digital device in which a real teacher is working with an evidence-based program and doing some things digitally in practice or supplementing, and then the rest is an interaction, just like for me with you, Eduardo. We are interacting, and the interaction is so important for human beings. So I never want only digital with adults, but it can be very helpful. It just has to be carefully done.
Okay. Well, a last question, Maryanne. And this one, so we all kind of go home with some food for thoughts.
Okay.
On your books, you mentioned the importance of the working with books since the child is born.
Yes.
And that this contact with books and reading has, well, there are a lot of studies that indicates that this will point how successful this child will be as a reader. In a country as in Brazil, as unfortunately so little people read for economic and social reasons, historical reasons, how can we do to address this problem? We know some kids will be on the tracks to have a high performance reader, deep reader, but what can we do to close the gap with people that we know today that they won't have this experience previously?
Yes. So I had the pleasure and privilege of working with a Brazilian graduate student years ago. And what she did was created a program in basically a favela. I can't remember whether it was in Sao Paulo or Rio, but what she was doing is she took one parent in a group, and she taught that woman to read and teach reading and help the rest of the people in that neighborhood learn to read enough to read to their child. So it was very child specific, but it was using the mothers or the fathers to, in this case, it was all women, but using the maternal love and desire for education for the child in reading every day to the child. And the books were very, very, very simple because the mothers hadn't learned to read. But this was an experiment that was a beautiful one. And it was very, this was an experiment. It was a study, but it produced wonderful results in that one time and period. I would suggest to you to have a campaign in Brazil between 0 and 3 or 0 and 5 and say 2,000 days of reading to your child. It took 2,000 days for our species to learn to read. It takes 2,000 days to prepare to read. So maybe you could call the campaign 2,000 days or 2,000 nights. Just read every night to your child. You will see a difference. I suggest that you talk to the Canadian Children's Literacy Foundation. They have a program called First Words, and they're doing that in Canada with the same problems. So I would encourage you to learn what they have done. And then pediatricians, I think that's also in Brazil, called Reach Out and Read, where pediatricians give a book at every well visit and teaches the parent just to read to their child and just to make it a loving relationship between the child and the beauty of the parent's voice and the book itself. I wish I had more time to tell you about this, but this is an essential aspect of bringing joy and love to books from day one for our children.
Thank you very much, Maryanne. I will switch back to Portuguese now, just for final addressing. Bem, pessoal, queria agradecer mais uma vez a participação de todos e de todas, a participação da Maryanne Wolf. A gente vai estar no YouTube a gravação do áudio em inglês, assim como a tradução, para quem quiser consultar depois, né, ouvir a fala diretamente da Maryanne. E ela disponibilizou a apresentação, a gente vai deixá-la disponível no site da Abrelivros, tá bom? Eu vi que alguém perguntou do contato dela, tem na apresentação, depois vocês podem acessar para entrar em contato com a Maryanne. Um ótimo fim de tarde para todos. Muito obrigado. Thank you, Maryanne.